Well, welcome back to the show today, folks. We have our special friend, Dr. John Byron. John is a distinguished professor at Ashland Theological Seminary. He's previously been on to discuss one of his books, A Week in the Life of a Slave. And I guess after that conversation, John sent me a piece about some work that he has done that's of interest to him. It's about Cain and Abel, a story that everybody's familiar with in the Bible, Christians, non-Christians, and how it has influenced music, musicians, from Bruce Springsteen to John Mellencamp to Cher to the Indigo Girls and Prince and so forth. So we're going to let John enlighten us today and share about culture, music, and Cain and Abel. And John, look forward to the conversation, brother.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I appreciate you having me back on and chance to talk with you and perhaps share some interesting information with your listeners that they may not be aware of. So,
Yeah, well, I'm certainly it's going to enlighten us. So, how did you get interested in this topic?
yeah, that's a good question. So, it actually happened when I was in my PhD program, and I was in a New Testament seminar at the University of Durham, and we were looking at the book of James. And in James chapter 5, there James is condemning those who are oppressing the workers and not giving them their wages. And he talks about how they are crying out to you. And there were some echoes there for me of the blood crying out of Abel from the ground. And really, to be quite frank, it was just a hunch. But what I discovered was, Ken, but just by that little hunch, by kind of picking up on the echoes there within the letter of James, that there is just a large tradition, interpretive tradition in Jewish and Christian circles, in which they begin to try and address the interpretive, I would say, gaps in the story. And as they do that, they begin expanding the story, not to change it in a malicious way, but they're expanding it because they're trying to answer the questions, all the same questions that you and I have. So let me give you at least just two quick examples. The first one is, if you read the original Hebrew text of Genesis 4, it just simply says that after God had resisted Cain and Abel's sacrifice, that it just says, and Cain and Abel were out in the field. And Cain rose. It doesn't say that he killed him in the Hebrew. And then that he's dead because God says, what's happened. But when you move on later on to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, what we know is the Septuagint, they recognized this gap. And apparently everybody was like, well, what happened? How did he kill him? And so the Septuagint actually puts and Cain killed Abel. And in fact, your English Bibles cannot tell the story the way you know it without including that line from the story of Cain and Abel. And so that became for me the beginning of, I would say, probably 10 years of exploration. Eventually, I published a book on it with Brill, Cain and Abel in Jewish and Christian interpretations. And I literally went verse by verse through every verse of the Cain and Abel story in Genesis 4 and looked at how it had been interpreted, reinterpreted, from literally about the time of the Septuagint right through up Augustine and Jewish literature. It was a large work. It was a fun work. I learned quite a bit and found some very interesting approaches. So,
Well, yeah, I think just the topic, when you sent that to me, just being a musician and familiar with music, and I've always had an interest in a lot of these bands or musicians. They're not Christians, but
right.
if you read their lyrics or you listen to their songs, you go, my goodness, John, those guys have read the Bible a time or two,
Right.
because you could not have written that particular song without having some type of a background or a basis from the scripture.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Ken. As you and I had been chatting earlier, the way that I fell into literally again, looking at it in pop and rock music. So after spending probably about 10 years working on this topic, not just looking at how the story had been reinterpreted in Jewish and Christian literature, but I even explored into the area of artwork, particularly in how the Cain and Abel story had shown up in Jewish and Christian interpretations in art. But then one day, I don't know what I was doing. I think I was cleaning carpets in our bedroom or something like that one day during the summer. And one of my secret loves is classic rock. I like all kinds of music, and there was a Bon Jovi song on there, "Blaze of Glory," and it's talking about I'm the Cain to your Abel. And I heard that. I mean, I had heard that song. I had to have been hundreds of times over the years, but I never heard that line, or at least not that clearly. And so as a result of that, I said, I just, again, it was another hunch. I'm like, I wonder. So, and now here's the problem is I'm not a musician. I don't read music. I don't play an instrument. And I'm like, where do I even begin to, discover this? So I actually found a lyrics database on the internet, and it's probably just generated by an algorithm or something. I don't know. But I began working in this database, just putting in simply Cain and Abel, and trying to find where were there times when this song was when this song mentioned a song mentions these figures, and I was amazed just how much there was there. I forget exactly how many hits I initially got there that I had said on the thing. According to what I'm looking at here in my paper now, I had 800 results. And then, I ended up focusing on 55 songs in the end, just trying to bring it down. And then slowly but surely, I just began really kind of just focusing in on music from the 1970s and the 80s, partly because I noticed a concentration of the occurrences then for whatever reason. And also, let's be honest, the 70s and the 80s was when I was listening to good music. I joke with people, anything after 1990, I mean, there was nothing good written after that, unless it's Mark Knopfler, so which Ken and I have talked about. So yeah, that was the beginning of my exploration. But to your point, Ken, what I discovered, what makes these songs even more interesting to me is not just the references, but the background or the possible background in the life of the individual artists that wrote these lyrics. Clearly, they had been impacted by this story, whether they read it in the Bible or they just know it from it being in the ether of the culture here in the North America. They know the story, even if they've not read the Bible.
Well, let's start off with the first one you have there is one I think that many people will be familiar with. Bruce Springsteen, Adam raised a Cain.
Yeah, so a 1978 song, Bruce Springsteen, he comes in, he is talking about how Cain had killed Abel and was cast out into Eden. Springsteen says that the song was inspired by the 1955 film East of Eden with James Dean, which of course is based on John Steinbeck's book, which happens to be one of my all-time favorite books. I'm a Steinbeck fan, but I particularly love East of Eden. But it's interesting to hear even just some of the lines in the songs. You're born into this life praying for the sins of somebody else's past. You inherit the sins, you inherit the flames. It becomes pretty clear as you learn more about Springsteen, and then I read his autobiography later. It came out in 2016. Springsteen at times, like many of us, had a tense relationship with his father. They weren't estranged as far as I can tell, but it was difficult, but particularly in the early years. And let's be honest, I'm not, I wonder how many young men and young women, didn't have trouble with at least one or both parents in their early years. But Springsteen's lyrics reflect that as he is writing in this song. And he continues to go on. In fact, later on in 1993, when he sings the song in a concert, he introduces it and he says, this is a song about fathers and sons. And he himself had just recently become a father. And this is interesting, Ken. He's seeing things in his newborn son that's already beginning to scare him because he's seeing himself. He's seeing the past. And so that's the first song that Bruce came up with. And
That song is just if folks want to look at that, there's a live version live at the Paramount from 2009. It's just so intense. He's sitting there playing this thing in E minor and on his Telecaster, just jamming and just ripping it, and just the intensity that he has. You can tell there's something personal about it to him.
yeah,
He mentioned those things, and I believe you mentioned he grew up Catholic.
he did, yeah. That was one of the interesting things I discovered again as I was reading his autobiography is that, he grew up Roman Catholic in New Jersey. But what was also interesting was he went to Catholic school, as everybody did in those days when they were there. And he's carrying with him, I guess you would say the memories, if not the trauma of things, being literally beaten in front of everybody in early morning mass for not memorizing something. And um, but at the same time, he gives an interesting description. The church where he goes to had its first service ever in his house. Right now, I don't think he was there as a kid when it happened, but he's aware of this, that the church actually formed in his home and that the very first funeral was there. And so for Springsteen, I mean, he even comments, he goes, I can't escape the church, whether I want to or not. And I just find that is so interesting, particularly in the Cain and Abel story. There's something there he can't fully escape, even if he wants to. Um, and then later on in 2009, when he did the song "What Love Can Do," he throws in this line about we all bear the mark of Cain, which I will say to your listeners, when you do that search on the lyrics, that phrase from the Cain and Abel story about the mark of Cain and what was the mark, which because we don't know, that is the one that shows up the most in all of the songs that we look at. But for Springsteen, um, a person who later on has kind of come to terms with this, with his past and with his past as a Catholic. Um, he says, I'm always going to be a Catholic. He still has some questions about God, but you can see he's coming to grips with it. But to your point, this story is part of the internal landscape of Bruce Springsteen, I would say. It's like an old friend for him, this story. It just keeps coming up, and it's how he frames his life, particularly between fathers and sons.
Yeah, and I think he says, once you're on the Catholic team, you're on the team.
Yeah, you can't get off the team. Yeah.
Yeah, and he says, as strange as people may find it, he says, I have a relationship with Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. He admits that he doesn't see Jesus to be quite as powerful, as others, but yeah, you kind of get this sense, and I've seen this with other people. He is rejecting the formal trappings and even the abuses that he has witnessed and experienced through religion, but he's not ready to give up on God yet. And I admit wholly that I am putting words and thoughts into Springsteen's mouth here, but I'm taking it based. I'm I'm surmising this based on what he had said in his autobiography. So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, there's just Springsteen is just one of those artists that he has just such a passion and an intensity. His live performances are pretty much legendary.
mhm.
For people who have gone and seen him, they said, "Man, that's like one of the best concerts I've ever seen."
Yeah, in fact, one of my friends just last week, he lives in Sweden, and apparently he went to a Bruce Springsteen concert last weekend. So I didn't realize Springsteen was touring in Sweden right now, but apparently he's there. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I saw a clip. He was I guess he's running through Rome, but he was playing Circus Maximus in
oh
Rome. Uh, so Stephen Van Zandt and him were being interviewed.
hmm.
Well, the next one that you have, moving on from there, is John Mellencamp.
Yeah. Yeah, so John Mellencamp, of course, we all got to know him initially as John Cougar. All right. And and he actually lives just a couple hours from where I live. He lives across the state line for me in Indiana. And Mellencamp has always had this blue collar, I'm the normal guy attitude. And in fact, from what I understand, um, it was not unusual for students who attended Indiana University to see him walking around on campus, talking to people. So this persona that we all have gotten to know from him through his songs, you know, Little Pink Houses, even Jack and Diane. These were the songs that we grew up with as teenagers that really left a mark on us. It really it identified our own existence at the time in a way that I don't know that we could have. So I was surprised, I admit, to find so many references to Cain and Abel in his music. Yeah, a guy who writes Jack and Diane and and other things. I just was not what I was expecting. But from the very beginning in 1978, he talks about, and again, the lyrics are unusual, Ken. You hear him saying that, Cain and Abel and their old man playing croquet in the backyard. Two guys beat up the sole survivor. I'm like, what is this? These lines, but they've got to mean something to him. Later on in 83, then he gets now instead of just a line here, it's like, the croquet line is almost, you almost wonder if he was recalling a childhood memory that he was framing with the Cain and Abel story. But later on, I noticed there's a very interesting thing about the story is that he begins to take on for himself the persona of one or both characters. So in 1983, in A Warmer Place to Sleep, he says, "Well, I've seen the heart of darkness. I've read the writing on the wall, and the voice out in the desert was the voice out in the hall." And then he goes, "Once he called me Abel, and once he called me Cain, and for 40 days and 40 nights I slept out in the rain." Um,
It's full of biblical imagery. I
oh
mean,
my
just
gosh, yes, the
wow.
voice out in the desert. Cain and Abel, 40 days, 40 nights. It's got to be, sleeping in there. It's got to be referring to Noah. Um, so yeah, and then as you just keep going on, and the songs, they're not like every year, or I mean, but then later on, like almost 10 years later, he now has a song called Brothers. And in that song, he makes a clear reference to Genesis 4:9 about being my brother's keepers. He says to this brother, just because we have the same mom and dad doesn't mean I'm your keeper. And then he goes on and he starts, saying, I don't approve of anything you do because we're brothers. And then he goes, Cain and Abel, me and you, it's as normal as can be, this sibling rivalry. And
That's
so
pretty
it
clear
really does.
there.
Yeah, I mean, you really start to wonder, is there something going on here?
Mhm.
And then finally, Mellencamp in a later interview, and I'm trying to see what year it was. Actually, it was well, it was an undated interview, but I found it in 2019, I guess it was. But he said, he goes, he says, you know, you write songs that have the ability to connect with you on a powerful level. And he says, I have two brothers, and one is younger than me and totally different. He goes, that song, it's probably about me and my younger brother. And he goes, it's interesting. I didn't know it at the time that I wrote it. I thought it was more about Cain and Abel, but you know, as it's gone on, I realize that's what that song is about. You know, and it's interesting. That brother that he's talking about, his brother Ted, actually had managed his tours for many years and then passed away suddenly in 2016. So again, here's another personal aspect of the story for him.
And the story is just such a passionate story, Cain and Abel. And so, you know, men like Springsteen and Mellencamp, who are artists and probably had that kind of temperament about them, creative, you know, just really flows right into their writing.
No, it does. And I think this is an important point, Ken, that we have to keep in mind, particularly living in a Western culture, is even people who don't read the Bible, um, yet they are here and they have absorbed the stories of the Bible, whether we realize it or not. There are those stories which are they are perennially used by us in society, even if it's just the references. You know, Cain and Abel. I mean, the story of Noah's Ark. You know, his allusion there to raining 40 days and 40 nights. Um, Kids know that story because let's be frank, it's a tragic story, yet we make wallpaper out of it for kids' nurseries and you know Noah's Ark play sets and playmobiles and you know we don't recognize sometimes, even if we're not followers of Jesus and readers of the Bible, how much the stories of the Bible have become a part of our life and our culture. So
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You just see it through and through, all these different artists. And even when I was not walking with the Lord, you know, but I had this, like you say, I had this knowledge, just by being born where we were born, of
Yeah.
scripture, of stories. And, you know, that just, you would hear, like you heard that line, um, you know, blaze of glory. And, it just clicks with you. Think, wow, okay, that's coming from the Bible. That's coming from scriptures.
Right. Yeah. There's something there. Um, you know, that they're not, and I believe was it Blaze of Glory that I think was actually used in the as the soundtrack for Young Guns. So and you know, so there's a little bit of you can hear even there in the story of Billy the Kid and others that you know that Cain and Abel uh competition, if you will, that's there. You know, and let's be frank, um story story has the power to help us identify within ourselves and without. You know, take a look at every romance movie that we've seen or book. I mean, William Shakespeare kicked it all off with Romeo and Juliet, you know, and how many times has that story been retold? West Side Story, and time and again we see it. And here's the thing: no matter how many times we repeat the story, no matter how times we reconstruct it, and we know what's going to happen, we know how the story's going to end. There's a comfort to that. It's a place for us to hang our hat, and I would say mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. And story helps people to make sense of the world around them. And I would say for these artists, even if they're not particularly religious people, these stories still help them frame their world to this
Mm.
day.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it might not be a quote the Christian worldview, but it frames their worldview to that degree. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, one interesting thing about Mellencamp, Ken, I point out your listeners may have found it interesting because unless you dive into this like I did, you may not discover this. But Mellencamp, besides being a an award-winning songwriter, he's also he's written a play. with Stephen King. And in that King, it's called The Ghost Brothers of Darkland County. It actually hasn't done a whole lot as far as being produced. I think it played a few times, but there are clear allusions to the Cain and Abel story in there. But then the one thing that you and I were talking about before we came on air that is just um, an interesting occurrence in this story with Mellencamp is he's an artist. And so he has a website where you can go and you can look at paintings there. And at the time when I was working on this, he had a painting of himself, a self-portrait standing there, and it was literally the same picture twice, um, of the same person, like a mirror image, except for that one of the individuals, one of these twins, was actually holding a knife that had some blood dripping off of it. And scrawled at the bottom of the painting were the words Cain and Hevel, which is actually the transliteration for the Hebrew names Cain and Abel. Um, there's no explanation for the picture, nothing. I mean, I couldn't figure out anything, but it's hard to escape when you hear him, when you look through the songs and even just the brief comments he makes about his brother. Um, he somehow frames himself as being Cain or Abel. I guess it depends on the context, but I mean, what a fascinating thing to discover about an artist when you realize that this really does move just beyond their music. So
Yeah, I thought that that painting was so clear, especially with the names you mentioned. Well, his last song that he referenced was Fruit Trader.
right. Yeah, and in that one, he's sitting there and again, I can't say I actually knew this song before I looked it up. And it's probably not one of my favorites. But it's interesting there, him and these two brothers, Cain and Abel, they're in the business of selling watermelons, trying to get them picked before they burn up in the sun. And one brother kind of mouths off to the other. So Cain rose up and slayed his brother. And he makes this comment: the human soul and violence sometimes can be the next of kin. And then feelings of moments of desperation when the lowest dimension of the animal is let in. Um, he's using the Cain and Abel story to reflect a feeling I can identify with, those moments where anger turns into unexpected violence, perhaps, or maybe expected, but or I would say uncontrolled, and that it's only later you realize that this thing comes out, but you realize it's not something as easy to escape. It's your next of kin. Um, so yeah, Mellencamp it was an interesting, there's not a whole lot out there about him personally. He tends to be a somewhat private person in that way compared to Springsteen. Um, but nonetheless, it's amazing what you can find just by digging through the songs in his personal life that you can find. So
Yeah, the next artist that you discussed, and it surprised me that he would be in this list, was Prince.
I have to tell you that was that was very surprising. Yeah, because Prince. Oh my gosh, if there was ever a figure in pop and rock music that um, you know, church church leaders and parents held up as the epitome of the devil's music, it was Prince. Gosh, man, I mean, highly sexualized lyrics and performances. A brilliant musician, my gosh. I mean, it was because of him that Tipper Gore, Al Gore's then wife, started remember, now we have these warning labels on music. And it's interesting. I mean, I would think that this would have been something that came about as a result of death metal, and I grew up listening to AC/DC and Quiet Riot and that. And it wasn't because of them. It's because she clearly heard something. I wonder if it was one of her kids listening to the song Darling Nikki, which is pretty intense. And that was it. So But what's interesting about Prince is we all know him as this person and his tragic death. Yeah, I do have to say, he had to be one of the most brilliant marketing people out there. When Prince sold his name and his rights to his music to Sony, and he wasn't, he was, and everybody thought, this is silly. What are you going to do? And what did he do? He adopted a symbol as his name, and it was unpronounceable. And so what he did was he forced everybody to refer to him as the artist formerly known as Prince. So he kept his name. I mean, this is a brilliant person, if not troubled. Um, yeah, so anyway, I've always found that part interesting. But what a lot of people may not know is there was also a very deeply religious side to Prince. And as I discovered this, it was just, again, I came to have a different appreciation for him. He was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, but then later on, somehow he became converted to become a Jehovah's Witness in 2001, started attending the Kingdom Hall there in Minneapolis. But this was the one that I really couldn't believe. He would disguise himself and go door to door, like we all experience this. The two people come to our door, we knock, and we're like, oh gosh, it's the whole Jehovah's Witnesses, and we make a joke about it. Prince used to disguise himself to go out and do door-to-door evangelism, so he could participate. This is not a person just merely flirting with religion. This is somebody who has a deep interest and commitment to it, even if I don't completely understand all of it. So,
Yeah, I found that interesting that he would, go door to door. I mean, that's like you said, that's getting committed there. That's not just saying, well, I believe this. No, I believe it enough that I'm going to go tell you about it, John.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, you just can't imagine that, and people that reflect on what few friends he had. When I say few friends, I mean my understanding is he didn't have many close friends. Um, this is a person who clearly had suffered over his life from bouts of depression, and other mental illness challenges, and he would be calling these people, and he's still talking about God. He's still trying to reflect how his own life fits into all of this. And that's you see things, like in 1981 he had a song called Controversy, where it includes some musings on God and the words of the Lord's Prayer. I didn't know this song. Again, by the time I was listening to Prince, and it was only because it showed up on the radio. I mean, Purple Rain, the movie was out. He had a really cool purple motorcycle. That's what you saw on MTV. But there's this other layer to him that we haven't fully appreciated. Um, and then later on in 1987, he actually wrote a song called The Cross, encouraging people to remember the cross in the midst of their sadness and crisis, which seems to me to be not only good advice, but personally reflective of his own struggles.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. You see him perform that live, and, he's got a cross, whether it's shot in
mhm.
by light or whatever's on the side of his face. And he sings it like almost like a minister, an evangelist, like this is the cross, or, like you're talking about, remember it, pay attention, and that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then you
no,
talk about his loneliness and depression and just friends, or, whether he was isolated and so forth. But, his song, There Is Lonely, man, that'll make you depressed.
it will. Yeah, that's the song where he mentions very clearly the Cain and Abel story. And Ken, had you heard that song prior to reading my work?
I have not.
Yeah, neither did
That's not
I.
one of the that's not one of my top 10 Prince songs. I wasn't aware of that.
I wasn't either. And I'll tell you, when I discovered this, I actually went and bought it for like 99 cents on Amazon so I could listen to it. And I haven't done it for a while, but I'll admit, um, even though the song is, it's just this mournful ballad that he's singing, um, there's something attractive about it to me. And it really does express the depths of loneliness and isolation that he felt, and maybe that we do. For your listeners, let me just, read the lyrics. It's not a very long song,
No, it's
but
not.
it's
No.
powerful. It says, "Is it me, or did the room just get darker? Is it me, or did I just lay down and die? Is this a dream, or did the world just crumble at my very feet? How in heaven will I ever be all right? There is lonely, and there is lonely, and then there is how I feel right now." So, I mean, he says there's two kinds of lonely, and then he's even lower. And then he says, "Perhaps only Cain, when he slayed his brother, could ever come close to knowing how." Um, wow. Now, when I actually worked on this paper, and Prince had already passed away, Ken, and we had heard the story of how he had been found there, alone in his home, isolated. Um, this song, even though it was actually recorded many years before that, um, it just really spoke to me of the depth that he felt and his religious knowledge, the way he's there. He's searching. As I would say we all are, even as followers of Jesus, we are continuing to search for meaning. And Prince, like these other artists, found a way for the Cain and Abel story to help frame his life, or at least part of it. Um, so it's interesting. The song was actually recorded sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. And then it just languished for a while. And then eventually he published it then, actually, when he was able to get back the rights to his music. He then published it just 2 years before he became a Jehovah's Witness. So, he dies there in, he told a friend years later, that he had known, that had seen his sister for over several years. You know, he says to her, "You guys are like my family to me and my blood relatives." The people around him that had been dying, right? Family and that, he was he was grasping for wherever he could, but this loneliness, it really does express the depth of his loneliness. And it would be like, I mean, imagine if one of us had killed one of our siblings, our only sibling. Um, there wouldn't, I mean, I suspect there would not just be grief, but yeah, there is a loneliness of, oh, what have I done? It's almost like sometimes I wonder about Mellencamp and him in that artist's picture of painting himself as a twin. Cain and Abel as twins.
Yeah.
And we often hear about the depth of loneliness and despair that twins go through when one dies because they've been so close for their whole life. But yeah, the Cain and Abel story in Prince was just, I never saw that one coming. So
No, and those lyrics are so thoughtful. That's not a person who has a surface knowledge of scripture.
no.
He has to know more than just a little bit about the story. I mean, he has thought this through, and he's reflecting on his own, isolation, loneliness, depression to pen that.
Yeah, and one of the things I think we don't often think about when we think about the way that biblical narrative becomes a part of our life is, as children, we pick up parts of things along the way, and for whatever reason, they stick. I'll give you an interesting example. On Sunday, the church I attend, it's a more liturgical church, so we follow the lectionary. And so this week, the New Testament reading in Mark chapter 6 was the beheading of John the Baptist, with Herodias's daughter dancing and all of that. And immediately after the reading of the gospel in our church, we always then have a children's sermon, and the children come down And so when the pastor invited everybody to come down, the lady next to me looked, she goes, well, that was quite an interesting introduction to a children's story, a children's sermon. Yeah, because we're like, why would you do that? Why would you show that to kids? But the fact is, the Cain and Abel story is probably one of the most common stories told in Sunday school, at least when I was a kid, along with Noah's Ark, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah. And those stories, because we learn them early on, we hear them, they really do impact us and they become a way that we frame our lives. So, and I think that would help us too, because one of the things that I found where that showed up quite a lot, Ken, was not so much about the killing of Cain and Abel, but it was this story about the mark of Cain. In Cain and Abel's story, we have this reference here that God is going to put a special mark on Cain so that nobody kills him in turn. And we don't know what that mark was. And as a result, people, I mean, ever since the first time that thing was written down, people have said, well, what was the mark? How did they know? And that actually is the song that I found, that is the part of the story I found was the most. You can find this song referred to in lyrics by the Grateful Dead, Joni Mitchell, Kansas, Motorhead, which is not a group I ever really listened to, but White Snake. I mean, that's quite a diverse selection of people there. Motorhead, Joni Mitchell, Kansas, White Snake. But what was interesting, go ahead.
I said, that's some extremes
It is, it
difference.
is.
Yeah.
But two that I found particular interesting, actually three. One was a Israeli artist I'd never heard of before. Her name is Noah, Noa. And she is singing this song talking about pain and the results of the past. And she keeps talking about how she keeps carrying the mark of Cain. And then similarly, at the same time, now and then, she'll talk about child of pain. And twice during the song, she'll connect the two, the mark of Cain, the child of pain. And then what you discover, and you only get this if you actually read the lyrics, because we often don't hear lyrics
Yeah.
very clearly. What you discover is she's singing about an unborn child that she's carrying. She's pregnant, and that this unborn child is the result of a rape. And that it's something from her past that she cannot escape and will be with her forever. And I'm like, wow. So I don't know anything about this singer. I don't know her story, if this is one of her own or she's reflecting on something. But yeah, I mean, you sit there and you think about this. She is reflecting on this story, the mark of Cain, which, of course, if she's at all religious as a Jewish person in Israel, they'll know this story very well. But nonetheless, she has translated this now to talk about, the whole idea of carrying something that that she's going to have with her forever.
Yeah. She's wrestling whether she could love the child.
Exactly.
There's that internal conflict with that, and will the child bear the image of the rapist?
Exactly. And we've heard these stories before by women who are assaulted and raped and have chosen to keep the child, or they're from times when there was no choice, and then how they then have to, for the rest of their lives, they're going to continue to look at that child and remember what happened. So,
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with this Israeli singer either. It's a great song. I love the lyrics and everything, printed it
yeah.
all out. But again, I never expected to hear a song about rape and unborn child related to Cain and Abel. But
Yeah.
there it is.
So yeah, the next one, not as a little more well known, is from the Indigo Girls, and it's this song, "Become You," and it was written by Amy Ray in the group, and she's reflecting on the fact that she comes from the North rural Georgia, and the conflicted identity she has as a Southerner who's proud to be from Georgia, yet at the same time is struggling with the lingering pride of the Confederacy, and the complicitness of her ancestors, perhaps in that area. And so she goes on there, and at one point, she goes, "Our Southern blood, my heresy, damn that old Confederacy." And then as she goes through on, she goes, "The landed aristocracy exploiting all your enmity, all your daddies fought in vain, leave you with the mark of Cain." And it took a long time to become the thing I am to you, and that thing that she's trying to talk about is her struggle with the Southern heritage. And I think, again, since I wrote this paper, I mean, we've seen this even more. When I wrote the paper, we were at that point, we were beginning to struggle with the idea of what do we do with monuments? To what extent do we honor the past, whether we were fighting on opposite sides, but how do we honor human beings? I mean, Lori and I just came back from a trip in Germany, and we see this going on there as well, where they are struggling with how do we reconcile um, their participation in World War II, but they've also got World War I, where Germany was not actually the aggressor there. In World War I, they were just part of a domino effect of alliances, but they got blamed for the war. And so instead, we saw this monument where they just had a soldier, a bronze statue, and it was "To Our Fallen." And I forget exactly how they've worded it now, but they honored them a little bit more for World War One. In World War II, they simply acknowledged that they had fallen. And they're still, like we are in this country, they're still struggling with, gosh, these were my ancestors. I am who I am because of them, but what do I do about that? And so for Amy, for her, Amy Ray, this is her mark of Cain. She's carrying this, and I found it interesting. Nothing, just to make it clear to your readers, nothing that I read about Amy Ray described this, but I found it was interesting that she was born in 1964 in Decatur, Georgia, only 10 miles from Stone Mountain. And of course, Stone Mountain has the faces of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. I mean, these are the heroes of the Confederacy. And whether we agree or disagree on that status, I understand why these people were chosen. Um, I was surprised, however, and my apologies to Southerners who are listening to me and you again, but I was surprised to learn that Stone Mountain was dedicated exactly 100 years on the day of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Um, I was like, that couldn't have been a mistake, but maybe it was. But I did wonder, because this is also the place where the Ku Klux Klan was rebirthed after it had fallen out of favor. And I can't help but wonder if her context there is just part of, seeing that monument there, which from what I understand, I've not seen it myself, but if I was there, I would go see it. But my understanding is, I mean, it's a place where they have concerts and picnics. It's in many ways a quote family friendly place, but it's got this imposing picture of these heroes, oppressors, enslavers, and that's part of I think that's part of the mix of the mark of Cain that she's talking about, that she carries. So
Yeah, she's really wrestling with
yeah.
that whole process.
So yeah, a couple after that, Ken. I mean, yeah, there's a number one. There's some that I just didn't know them. I found them in movies, for instance, things like that. But the one that I would like to talk about, to finish off with about this section, is the opening scene of The Talented Mr. Ripley.
Yeah,
Have you ever seen that movie?
I have. Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's been years since I've seen it. My understanding is I guess they've come out with a new a new version of it that's now it's serialized, so it goes on. Um, but of course, in the movie, the gentleman that is there, and I can't exactly remember all the characters' names. It's been so long, but eventually he ends up killing the other person that he wants to become. It's Matt Damon, of course, and Jude Law. I do remember that, and Gwyneth Paltrow, and William Seymour. Okay, I remember the characters. I just can't remember their names in the movie. But William Seymour, he figures out something's not right here, and he ends up getting killed. But it's this whole thing where he's trying to take over the persona of Jude Law's character and become him. And the stage is set where Sinead O'Connor sings a song, a lullaby for Cain. And when you read the lyrics of the song, what you discover is that the song is being sung by Eve, Cain's mother. And in the song, she recalls how Cain was envious, he was murderous. And during all of this time, all right, she's mourning his exile, his nightmares. My sleep is going to be constantly disrupted. And he carries this mark, this shame of Cain. So it's like Prince's song. I have to say I find it attractive to me. There's something about it. There's something emotive about it. It just gets me in a part that I can't fully describe, and that's that. I guess that's part of the. I guess that's part of the power of music. It sometimes touches us in areas we didn't expect. And I don't know. I know, of course, about Sinead O'Connor, who recently, within the last year or two, I think, took her own life after her son had done so. But she was somebody. I thought it was interesting that she was singing the song. You may remember her incident on Saturday Night Live, and it was in the late '80s or '90s where she got on Saturday Night Live and ripped a picture of the Pope in half. And that was really a defining moment for her career. And I don't mean a good one. Coming from Catholic Ireland, she received quite a bit of blowback because of that one. So, yeah.
I would imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes the artists can say things and do things that they regret.
Yeah, well, I think we all do that. Unfortunately for them, they've got a much bigger platform than most of us do. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I just saw something, Trump's assassination attempt. Jack Black, one of the band members made a comment while they're playing out in the live audience, I wish he hadn't have missed.
oh, yeah.
And now there's just this huge blowback from all that. But yeah, the song right there, Lullaby for Cain, to me, that got me too, because I guess I just don't really think about it from Eve's perspective.
No.
I'm thinking about, from, Cain's perspective, and maybe Adam's, but, I've just never looked at it from Eve's. And, cast into the dark, branded with the mark of shame of Cain, from a garden of God's light to a wilderness of night. Well, just vivid, powerful lyrics to that song.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if Sinead O'Connor wrote that song or somebody wrote it for her. I can't remember, but nonetheless, it really does. It reflects, like you said, a perspective from Eve. And here's what's interesting about that. When I first studied the Cain and Abel story and how it was being reinterpreted, um, that really was. Sometimes it was people, they were interpreting the story to fill in the gaps. Well, where did Cain get his wife? Um, whatever happened to Cain? The Bible never says that he died, so what happened? Um, and so, but what you're discovering too is, the same way, just like the ancient interpreters, we as modern people, we have questions about the story. Well, what did Eve think about this? I mean, we never hear from Eve again, right? That's it. She disappears from the story. And so this song, besides offering a haunting beginning to the movie Talented Mr. Ripley, It also gives us a little more perspective on the biblical story. The Bible doesn't tell us everything. That's fine. It's not designed to, but there are other points. So
Yeah, then you've got Cher weighing in on this.
yeah, so Cher, this is my last song that I had looked at, and my last artist. Yeah, this one we talk about getting yourself in trouble. Cher, this was a song that was clearly targeting the Roman Catholic Church at the time in 2000. And right. She refers, her song is called Sisters of Mercy. In the lyrics, she refers to the nuns of Sisters of Hell. And when Cher actually was interviewed about this, it's because, I mean, it has to do with her background. When she was a young girl, her mother would put her in an orphanage. And my impression is this was not a place that Cher was like left to then be adopted by. It was almost like they didn't have a form of daycare, so you could leave her mother would leave her there at night while she was working, so she could make money. But apparently shares experiences there were not very good. And one time when the mother did come, the nuns tried to convince her to put the girls up for adoption. Said she was unfit. And then the nuns kept her, and it took her mother 6 months to get her back. Yeah, and so again, I don't know all what was going on there, but it's clear that this has made a deep and lasting impression on Cher. And in the lyrics, the one particular line that just struck me was, "In God's house, she's held a hostage by a cruel and heartless mob. Sisters of mercy, daughters of hell, they always weave the web of lies and wrap you in their wicked spell. Sisters of mercy, masters of pain, they try to crucify our innocence and do it in God's name." So there she's weaving through some biblical imagery with the ideas of hell and crucifixion. And then in the end is when she brings in the idea of Cain and Abel. She switches from calling them daughters of hell to daughters of Cain. And that's the only reference in the whole song to Cain and Abel. But I couldn't help but put it in the paper, because in the article, because I'm like, clearly what she is saying is you are perpetuating the same level of violence that Cain did against your brothers and sisters, and therefore you are a daughter of Cain. And so yeah, apparently she learned a few things in that orphanage in her brief stay there. So
Yes, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I thought that was pretty powerful. Once you know the backstory on that, you can relate a little bit more to the lyrics and to the song of what she's really expressing. There's kind of an anger that's coming out of her that she's pretty ticked off at the church. She's kicked off at the nuns and
Yeah.
and all that. Well, the last one you have is Joan Baez. You got a couple of songs from her, "The Crimes of Cain" and "Sasha."
Yes. Well, that one with Joan Baez there, particularly what's interesting is the song focuses on remembering the Holocaust and all that was lost, which it's interesting because particularly now as we are beginning to see more and more um, occurrences of Holocaust denial as we get further and further away, people questioning it. I saw something recently. I don't watch a whole lot of television news or listen to pundits, but I saw something somewhere, somebody questioning if um, the idea that Nazis did experiments on people, was this just nothing more than propaganda, or that less than 300,000 people actually died in the camps. Um, I don't know what led Joan Baez to write this song, but it's set in Germany around Heidelberg. Again, I don't know why she chose that. Interesting enough, this is where Joseph Goebbels was from. So maybe there's something there. But in one line, there is a wounded German soldier, a Nazi soldier. He's of the Third Reich, lying in a hospital bed, and he's being approached by a prisoner of the camp. Somebody, this is after the war, obviously, and the soldier says to him, "If you are Abel and I am Cain, forgive me from my bed of pain." And the appeal here to Genesis 4, the Cain and Abel story, I took it as it really does seem to be this idea that even though people are enemies, ultimately we're still brothers. That's an interesting thing for me, Ken, because we have heard stories over and over again, particularly in the context of war, where two people from opposite sides, they would come and find one another in a, they may have ended up in a separated from the battlefield, and we hear these stories where people rediscover their humanity. I've read stories about, I like to read Stephen Ambrose books and, other things World War II, and I watch documentaries. And, the idea that when American soldiers, for instance, met Germans, they had these ideas of, what they would be like, and they were just like you and me. They're human beings. And so I think John Baez's song is, it's reflecting on this and how the biblical story, that tragedy there it can also just simply help us frame our reality. So.
Yeah. I think maybe we didn't mention, but I think one of Springsteen's songs had the same, something about love. Refresh my memory here, but
See
it
what
was like,
love can do.
yeah, what love. That's all right. Yeah, what
Yeah,
love can do is kind of the same sentiment, maybe forgiveness, love. Uh,
exactly.
uh, yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the things that's so attractive to us about the Cain and Abel story is in the midst of a heinous crime, um, God does not execute Cain. He offers him some form of protection, and Cain goes off and he lives.
a lot of people have a problem with that.
They do. They do. And in fact, if it's all right with you and your listeners, I'd like to share something with you. I know we've got just a few more minutes here, but I'd like to share with you another way the song was interpreted by artists, if you will, but actual like graphic artists. And what I mean here is through artwork. So I'm going to just share my screen, and can you all see that very well? All right. So one of the things that comes up at time to time when I study this story was the question of who killed Cain? Because when you begin looking at the story, um, Cain wanders off to the land of Nod, and we never hear whatever happened to him. And it almost leaves a bad taste in our mouth. Where did Cain go? What happened to him? How did he die? And so I began looking into this, and there are various, quote, solutions that ancient interpreters came up with. And then what I discovered is I would read these interpretations, and I'm going to share some of them with you. And I thought at first, oh, these are just, random things that one or two writers wrote. No, actually, they were widespread, and they were so widespread, they ended up in the artwork of the church. So you are looking here at you're looking here at a relief that is on the outside of the Modena Cathedral in Italy, dating from the 11th century. And you can see we have here the story of Cain and Abel. There's Abel there offering his lamb. There's Cain over here offering his grain. And then there's God in the middle here, whether or not he's going to accept this. And then off there to the right is Cain killing Abel. In this case, he's using a club. Sometimes the stories say he used a stone. Actually, the Bible doesn't tell us at all how he died. But what's interesting then is what happened, because in Genesis, God declares, albeit after the Cain and Abel story, whoever sheds the blood of a human, shall that person's blood be shed. In other words, you destroyed the image of God, you should be destroyed. And then we see a repeat of this later on in Exodus 12, right? If somebody willfully attracts and kills another by treachery, you shall take that killer from my altar to execution. And so interpreters, because they see the Bible, they don't see it chronologically like you and I might at times, like, well, that hadn't been declared yet. They're like, well, this is crazy. Innocent Abel gets killed. What happened to Cain? And so they began trying to work with things. And what's interesting is, so some people like Philo of Alexandria, who you may or may never heard of, and that's okay, but he was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul. Philo reads this as a philosopher, and he comes to the conclusion, well, Cain never died. But for Philo, I mean, he's not really going down the road of saying, oh, he's still walking around. No, Philo takes the idea that Cain never died, and he uses that to leap into a philosophical aspect that the wickedness that all of us are carrying are a result of Cain. And so philosophically, allegorically, if you will, all of us are carrying that symbol of wickedness, what Cain did. But then what's interesting is how many people, that's an interesting perspective I file. A majority of interpreters actually came to the conclusion that Cain was killed by the flood. So if you look at Wisdom, chapter 10, verses 3 and 4, which is in the book of, it's in the Apocrypha, all right, those books between our Old and New Testament. They say that the earth was flooded because of him. Okay, and then talking about Noah. But if you look through, and I won't go through all these because most of these are Jewish and Christian writings that the average person never looks at, and that's okay. But as I was looking, I'm like, okay, everybody thought Cain was killed by the flood. Makes sense. All right, he lived a long life and then he drowned. Well, actually, no, because there is another problem, or another approach, I should say, and that is that his uncle Lamech, or sorry, his nephew Lamech killed Cain. And this becomes based off of this statement. When Lamech kills a man by accident, he then declares to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to me what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70-fold. And I don't have time to go into it all with you today, Ken, because it requires looking at various nuances and ambiguities in the Hebrew. But this actually led to people suggesting that Lamech killed Cain, first by accident. In one book, Cain was killed by accident because Lamech was building a wall. Cain was sleeping on the other side, and the wall fell over and killed Cain. And then later on, you begin to notice the idea that Cain's descendants were continually evil. So Lamech and his sons, they killed Cain together with one of his sons. And this goes on. Then later on, again, you can see the story develops, and I've got it bolded here. Lamech was blind. So the story keeps expanding. How could he kill Cain? Doesn't he know he should? Oh, well, he was blind. It was an accident. He shot an arrow towards the spot, and he shot Cain right between the eyes, but it was a complete accident because he thought that he was dealing with an animal in the bushes. Well, go back to that same cathedral in Modena, Italy, and if you continue to move to the right, here you have Cain being killed by Lamech. And what struck me about this, Ken, was this is an odd story. It doesn't show up anywhere in the Bible. We would see these things out there, these other written versions, and we might think, well, these are just, these are fringe interpretations. Not so fringe that they didn't end up in the artwork of churches. Take a look at this. This is not an artwork in a church. This is in a book printed in England in the 14th century, Egerton Genesis. And there you have the picture. You have Lamech right here, his son pointing to the bushes, and Cain being shot, and Cain is killed. Another one right here, 14th century. And then this one here in France. All right. This story only 500 years ago was very popular. And then here is the column of a church, of a cathedral from France. And here you have Lamech with his bow and arrow, and you've got his son pointing over to the bushes, and there's Cain being shot with the arrow. I show this to you because I want to just demonstrate the power that this story has had on artists and interpreters from the very beginning. And when we talk about the power of scripture to form the narrative of our lives, um, it's been ongoing. And certainly, I don't think, I don't go around and preach the story that Cain was killed by Lamech, things like that. But it's interesting to me from from the standpoint of studying us as God's people, how we try to make sense of the story so we can make sense of our lives. So that was just a little bonus I wanted to share with you today and your listeners. So
Well, that's a great bonus. That's why you're the scholar, and you have done the research on that and done your homework. Yeah, I read your other paper on that, and I found that to be really interesting. You go into the words, or I believe you said, "I have gotten a man." The Hebrew word "ish," and
yep.
the same word is used there. So, yeah, that's all good stuff, John.
Well, great.
Yeah. Well, man, I don't know how to close this out, but I'm just overwhelmed with the story and how people have used it in different ways to, to their situations wherever they're at in life. And yeah, from Bruce Springsteen to Mellencamp to Cher. and,
I would say that probably just a way we can close it out, Ken, is I think, particularly at this time in our nation's history where, I mean, it's not just the political and cultural tensions, it's even the role of religion in our society. And um, I think we as followers of Jesus can use, maybe not use it, I think we need to remember just to what extent the biblical narrative has framed us, whether we realize it or not. And that these can be opportunities to remind us and those that we're talking with and we're interacting with, just the influence that scriptures had. Because there are people out there, and there's variety of approaches to this who find the influence of scripture to be very negative, very positive, and I would say at times, the Bible has been used incorrectly, certainly. But I would also say there's a long, long history of positive influences, and the way that we have been able to frame our lives, um, like Bruce Springsteen said, I can't escape, I live here. He said that in his biography, about living in the house that was the church. And it's the same for us. We can't escape it. And the question is then, how are we going to live in that and allow the Bible to continue to shape our lives, to continue to shape our story? As North Americans, particularly in the last 100 to 200 years, the last 100 years, I would say more, we have really fallen into a bad habit of treating the Bible like an answer book. If I can just turn to page 10 and find out what I'm supposed to do in this situation, Jesus will tell me the three things I need to do to, live a happy, prosperous life, or to get rid of this person who's annoying me. um, Rather, I would argue the framework of the Bible is narrative. It is story. It is God's story from Genesis to Revelation. And rather than us using it as an answer book, I'm not saying it doesn't contain answers for us, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is the Bible, with the gaps in the story, the way at times it makes us uncomfortable with things that it shares that we would never want to do, I would say the Bible is inviting us into God's story to weave together our story with the story of what God is doing in the world. and to see ourselves on the same journey that Cain and Abel, Abraham, David, the Apostle Paul, Silas, we are all on that same journey, that same story of walking with God and going wherever God is taking us, which is ultimately to the fulfillment of his kingdom. So allow the Bible to shape your lives in that way. So how's that to end a story?